3 weeks after knee replacement surgery, I asked my son for a ride to the bank Monday morning. He laughed. "Figure it out, old man. You can still walk." Then he hung up. My daughter-in-law rushed over within 20 minutes. 63 minutes later, I left the bank and pressed a brass key into her palm. "Hide it from your husband," I whispered. "My son has no idea what he just lost." I appreciate each of you joining Dad's Revenge Stories today. Where are you watching from? Let me know your city or country in the comments below. Please note, parts of this narrative feature creative adaptations for perspective and entertainment. Any resemblance to actual people or settings is incidental, but the core message offers meaningful insight. The Monday morning my son laughed at me was not the morning everything fell apart. It was the morning I finally stopped pretending it hadn't already. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened. I am 79 years old. I had my left knee replaced 3 weeks before that Monday. And yes, walking still hurt in the specific way that surgical recovery hurts, a deep mechanical ache that flares when you forget about it and reach for something on a low shelf. But I was not incapacitated. I made my own breakfast that morning. I read the newspaper, the actual paper, not the screen. I paid my electric bill online, which I mention only because my son once told a cousin I was, quote, struggling with technology. I was not struggling with anything except the particular loneliness of a house that used to have 2 people in it and now had 1. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the faint ghost of the lavender soap Helen had used for 40 years. I had not switched soaps. I don't know why. Some things you just don't change. I sat at the table with my mug and looked at the phone for a while before I picked it up. I want you to understand. This part clearly, I did not need to call Colton. I had the Uber app on my phone. I had used it 4 times since the surgery, twice to the pharmacy, once to the physical therapist, once to Gerald's office on the other side of Lancaster. I knew exactly how to get myself where I needed to go. But that morning I called my son first. Not because I couldn't manage. Because after 44 years of watching Colton grow from a boy into a man, I needed to see something. Just once. Just 1 simple hour on a Monday morning. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Hey, Dad." His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had been awake for a while, but hadn't yet decided to be fully present. "Morning," I said. "I need a ride to the bank. Shouldn't take more than an hour." There was a pause. Then he laughed. Not a warm laugh, not the kind you give when something genuinely catches you off guard and delights you. It was the short, dismissive sound of someone who has just been handed an inconvenience they find slightly absurd. "Figure it out yourself, old man," he said. "Bad knee doesn't mean you can't walk." The line went quiet. I realized he had ended the call. I sat there with the phone in my hand and the coffee cooling in front of me. I noticed I wasn't angry, which surprised me. I had expected anger. What I felt instead was something slower and heavier, a settling the way a house shifts after a long winter, all the stress finding its final resting place in the joints and beams. I thought about the last time Colton had driven me anywhere without being asked. I thought about Helen's last year, the appointments and the treatments and the long drives back from the hospital in Hershey when neither of us felt like talking, but we held hands anyway across the center console. I thought about the 8 years since she passed, and how many of those drives I had taken alone because my son was busy or tired or had something on his schedule that morning. I am not a man who keeps a ledger. Helen used to say that about me, and she meant it as a compliment. But sitting in that kitchen, I realized that some accounts have a way of balancing themselves, whether you're keeping track or not. I set the phone on the table. Looked out the window at the maple in the front yard, the one Frank Delaney from 2 doors down had helped me plant in 1987. Still standing. Bigger than either of us had imagined it would get. Then I picked up the phone again, and I dialed a different number. It rang twice before she answered. "Russell?" Nora's voice was clear, already alert. I could hear the faint sound of her coffee maker running in the background. She always started her second cup around this time. "Is everything okay?" "I need a ride to the bank," I said. "I know it's short notice." A beat. "Give me 20 minutes. She didn't ask why I was calling her instead of Colton. She didn't ask what I needed at the bank. She didn't ask whether I wanted her to come inside or wait in the car, whether the appointment was urgent, whether I had remembered to take my morning medications. 20 minutes, I said. "Thank you, Nora." After I hung up, I finished my coffee standing at the kitchen counter. I looked around the kitchen, the yellow curtains Helen had picked out in 1998, the row of ceramic canisters she had arranged, just so the small framed photograph on the windowsill of the two of us at Chincoteague the summer before she got sick. "Well," I said out loud to no one, and to her at the same time, "let's see what happens." 19 minutes later, a silver Honda pulled into my driveway. 20 minutes after I hung up, a car pulled into my driveway. It wasn't a taxi. Nora was out of the car before I made it to the front door. She had her coat half-buttoned, her dark hair pulled back in the kind of quick knot you do when you don't have time to do it properly, and she was carrying a small cloth bag over one shoulder. She moved across the driveway at a pace that told me she had left her house the moment she ended the call. "You didn't have to rush," I said. "I didn't rush." She looked at my feet. "Do you have your brace on?" "Yes." "Good." "Watch the second step, there's frost on the edge." That was Nora. She didn't hug me in that theatrical way some people do when they see an elderly man who has recently had surgery, as though they expect you to crumble if handled with anything less than ceremonial care. She just noticed the frost on the step and told me about it the way you tell a person you respect about a practical fact they might find useful. I watched her check the passenger seat before I got in. She had already placed a small water bottle in the cup holder and set a travel-sized pill case on the armrest. Inside the case were 2 of my anti-inflammatory tablets, the ones I was supposed to take mid-morning with food. "I guessed you might have forgotten these," she said without making it a comment on my memory or my age or my capability. Just a statement. Just a fact. "I didn't forget," I said. "I was going to take them after. So I'll take them now. I have a granola bar in the bag." I wanted to argue on principle, but my knee was already telling me that Nora was right, and my knee had been more honest with me than most people lately. I took the tablets. She handed me the granola bar without looking away from the road. We drove into Lancaster without much conversation, which was its own kind of conversation. Nora put on the radio at a volume that filled the silence without demanding anything from either of us. Some morning program, 2 people discussing a local high school basketball team's unexpected winning streak. I looked out the window at the November-colored fields along Route 30. The corn already cut down to stubble, the sky, that particular flat gray that Lancaster County does better than anywhere I've ever been. "How's the knee today?" she asked somewhere around the 30-minute mark. "Better than last Tuesday." "Are you sleeping?" "Enough." She nodded, both hands on the wheel. She didn't push. She never pushed. In 12 years of knowing Nora, 12 years of holiday dinners and minor emergencies, and the long middle distance of ordinary family life, I had never once seen her push for information she wasn't offered freely. I had watched my son push constantly, insistently, always circling back to whatever he wanted to know, wearing a person down with cheerful persistence until they gave in just to make him stop. Nora was the opposite of that. She asked once, she listened to whatever you gave her, and she let the rest be yours. We pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank on West King Street at 9:22. Nora found a spot near the front, without me having to suggest it. "Do you want me to come in?" she asked. "No, wait here. Take your time. I'll be an hour. Maybe a little more." She reached over to the back seat and came up with a paperback book already dog-eared to somewhere in the middle. She settled it open on the steering wheel without another word. I got out of the car, carefully tested my weight on the knee, the way the physical therapist had taught me, and walked toward the glass doors of the bank. I did not look back, but I knew she was already reading. I was inside for 63 minutes. When I came out, the sky had shifted to something slightly lighter, the gray thinning at the edges. Nora was exactly where I had left her. The book now turned face down on the passenger seat, her eyes tracking me across the parking lot, the way people track something they are quietly relieved to see. I got back in and closed the door. My right hand was closed around something small and warm from being held too long. I sat with it for a moment, that object in my fist, and I thought about the 63 minutes I had just spent in a room I hadn't entered in over a year. I thought about Helen's handwriting on the envelope inside the box, and the way seeing it had made my chest do something I hadn't expected. Not quite pain, not quite grief, something that lived in the space between the two that doesn't have a proper name. Nora didn't ask what had taken so long. She didn't ask what I was holding. She reached over and turned the heat up 2 degrees, because she had noticed, apparently, that I had come out of an air-conditioned building into a cold morning, and my hands were probably stiff. I looked at her profile, the straight line of her jaw, the slight tension at her temple that she always carried when she was thinking about something she hadn't decided whether to say. Then I opened my right hand. The key was small, brass plain, the kind of key that looked like it might open a mailbox or a garden shed, nothing that would tell you anything about what it actually unlocked. I held it out toward her, and when she looked down at it, I took her right hand off the steering wheel and pressed the key into her palm, closing her fingers around it one by one. "Keep that somewhere Colton won't find it," I said. She stared at her closed fist. When she looked up at me, her eyes had gone careful in the way eyes go when a person understands that something is shifting and isn't sure yet whether to be frightened. "What does it open?" she asked. "Something that isn't his." She swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the key. "Russell, my son has no idea," I said quietly, "what he just lost. Nora drove us north on Fruitville Pike without asking where I wanted to go. That was the kind of woman she was. She read a situation and moved, and she let you tell her the rest when you were ready." I sat with the key in my coat pocket, and the weight of the last 63 minutes settling into my chest. The way cold settles into an old joint slowly, thoroughly, in a way that tells you it intends to stay. After a few minutes, she said without looking away from the road, "There's a diner up here. They do a decent bowl of soup." "All right," I said. She pulled in. We sat across from each other in a wide booth, the kind that used to be standard before restaurants started making everything narrow and fashionable. She ordered without fussing. I ordered coffee. She waited until the soup came before she looked at me directly. "What does it open?" she asked. "A safe deposit box," I said. "First National downtown, box number 417. I've had it since 1998. Russell, keep it somewhere Colton won't find it." Her breath caught. I watched her chest rise and hold for a second before she exhaled. "Why would Colton?" "Because he'll look," I said. "He's been looking for a while. He just doesn't know what he's looking for yet." She pressed her closed fist against her sternum, like she was trying to keep the key from escaping through sheer pressure. "What's inside it?" "Things that belong to Helen," I said. "And things that belong to this family. Not to any one person in it." Her eyes went bright at the corners. Not tears yet, just the warning before tears. The kind of brightness that comes when something hits a place a person didn't know was tender. Russell, I don't understand why you're giving this to me. Because I've been watching you for 12 years, I said. And in 12 years, I have never once seen you do a single thing for this family that you expected to be repaid. She opened her mouth and closed it again, her jaw tight, fighting something. I have been watching you for 12 years, I said. I have seen what you do when no one is keeping score. The drives you didn't have to take. The hours you sat in waiting rooms without being asked. The things you fixed around this house because you noticed they needed fixing, not because anyone would ever know. I felt my throat tighten around the words. Helen noticed too. She told me once near the end, one of those quiet nights, she said that girl doesn't do things to be seen doing them. I asked Helen what she thought that meant. I stopped for a moment. She said it means she's the real thing, Russell. Don't lose track of her. Nora made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something low and broken that she pressed her lips together to stop. I'm not giving you this key because you drove me to the bank this morning, I said. I made this decision a long time ago. Today just told me it was time to stop waiting. What if I'm not the right person? Her voice came out rough, scraped, thin. What if I make a mistake? Then you'll fix it, I said. That's the difference, Nora. The right people ask if they're the right people. The wrong ones never think to wonder. She pressed the back of her free hand against her mouth for a moment, breathing hard through her nose, steadying herself. When she lowered her hand, her eyes were red at the edges, but her jaw was set. My son laughed at me this morning, I said quietly. He has no idea what he just lost. She looked at me for a long moment. Really looked the way people look when they're committing something to memory because they know they'll need it later. Okay, she said finally. Her voice was still rough, but it was solid underneath. Okay, Russell. She started the car. Neither of us spoke for several blocks. Then she cleared her throat and said, I'm hungry. There's a diner on Fruitville Pike that does a decent bowl of soup. That sounds fine, I said. Good. She checked her mirror and signaled. Because I have about 40 questions and I'm not asking a single one of them until I've eaten something. Despite everything, the weight of the morning, the key in her pocket, the particular grief of having finally said out loud what I'd been carrying for years, I almost smiled. Almost. We ended up at a diner north of town, the kind of place where the coffee arrives before you ask, and the booths are wide enough to spread a newspaper flat if you wanted to. Nora ordered vegetable soup and a half sandwich. I ordered coffee because apparently I had become exactly the man she'd predicted, the one who says he isn't hungry, and then steals his companion's crackers. She waited until the soup came before she asked her first question. The key, she said, breaking a packet of crackers over the bowl. You said safe deposit box 417. How long has it been there? Since 1998, I said. Helen and I opened it together. She chose the number said 417 was the address of the first apartment we rented after we got married. 1973, Philadelphia. Third floor, no elevator radiator that sounded like someone dropping a toolbox down a stairwell every morning at 6. Nora smiled despite herself. What's inside it? 3 sets of jewelry that belonged to Helen, I said. The diamond necklace she wore at our wedding. A bracelet her mother gave her, white gold family piece, probably 70 years old. Earrings, her wedding band, a watch I gave her for our 25th anniversary. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug because I needed something to hold. Total value somewhere around $380,000 according to the appraisal I had done in 2019. I don't think of them that way. But other people might. Nora set her spoon down. Colton doesn't know they're worth that much. Colton doesn't know they still exist, I said. He assumes I sold everything when Helen got sick. That's what he told himself, that we liquidated everything to pay for her treatment. It made the math easier for him, I think. She straightened in her seat. But you didn't. No, I took a sip of coffee. Helen and I managed differently. We had a financial advisor, Gerald Hatch. He's been with me 30 years, good man, steady, and Gerald helped us set up a property management arrangement that covered most of the medical expenses without touching the principal. Nora's forehead creased. What kind of property arrangement? Charantakin, I said. Helen and I bought 3 parcels over the years. First one in 1989 out on Millbrook Road. Nobody wanted it. Back then, price reflected that. Second one in 1994 off Junction Lane. Third in 1997 near the Clearview Corridor. Farmland adjacent, good drainage, nothing spectacular to look at. I paused. We put them with a property management company, a firm that handles leasing, maintenance, tenant relations. The rental income covered Helen's treatment costs. Has covered my expenses since. Quietly, without anyone needing to know. Nora had stopped eating. She was watching me with the focused attention of someone recalculating something important. Russell, what are those properties worth now? As of last spring, I said carefully, approximately $1.1 million, combined. She set both hands flat on the table. Colton thinks they were sold. Colton stopped asking about them after Helen died, I said. He asked once that first year I said we'd managed, and he heard what he wanted to hear. People usually do. He thinks your estate is what the house and whatever's in your accounts. That's my understanding of what he thinks, yes. She exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the tabletop, like she needed to feel something solid. And the deed to the properties, that's what's in the box. Along with the jewelry. Along with the management contracts, the appraisal documents, and a letter from Gerald outlining how the rental income has been distributed over the past 14 years. I looked at her steadily. Everything documented. Everything legal. Gerald's office holds copies. The box holds the originals. Nora picked up her spoon again, more for something to do with her hands than because she wanted soup. Who else knows about this, Gerald? I said. And now you. She pointed the spoon at me with a look that was equal parts exasperated and moved. Russell Dalton, you have been sitting on over $1 million in land assets and $380,000 in jewelry, and you have told exactly one other living person. 2 now, I said. 2 now, she repeated, and let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob landing somewhere in the complicated territory between them. She pressed 2 fingers against her lips, composing herself. Okay. What happens to them? The land, the jewelry. What's your plan? That, I said, is what I went to the bank to start putting in order. I wrapped both hands around my mug again. The jewelry stays in that box until my grandchildren are old enough to understand what it meant to the woman who wore it. The land, I've received an inquiry. Gerald is managing it. When the time is right, I intend to sell. I met her eyes. And I intend to decide what happens to the proceeds myself while I am alive, while I am clear-headed, and before anyone else decides for me. Nora held my gaze. Her eyes were dry now, but the redness hadn't fully faded from the corners. That's why you needed the bank this morning, she said. That's why I needed the bank, I confirmed. She nodded slowly. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on Fruitville Pike. The diner filled briefly with the sound of the kitchen, then settled back into its ordinary hum. You said Colton's been looking, Nora said quietly. How do you know that? I set my mug down, looked at the table for a moment. That, I said, is a longer conversation. And it's going to require you to have finished your soup first. After Nora dropped me off, I sat in my study for a long time before I turned on the computer. Some things you need to be ready to look at. The study was the one room in the house I had changed after Helen died. Not dramatically, I hadn't repainted or rearranged the furniture into something unrecognizable. But I had moved her reading chair out and put in a second desk, and I had let the bookshelves accumulate the particular disorder of a man who lives alone and answers to no one about where he sets things down. Helen would have had opinions about the disorder. I missed her opinions every single day. The security camera system had been Gerald's idea. Last November, the Pattersons 3 doors down were broken into while they were visiting their daughter in Ohio. Somebody took a laptop, a television, a jar of quarters Frank Patterson kept on his dresser for the laundromat. Gerald called me the week after it happened and said, "Russell, I want you to have cameras. Front door, back door, and your study, non-negotiable." I told him I'd think about it. He said, "I've already sent you the installer's number. His name is Dale. He's good and he's fast." That was Gerald. He framed everything as a suggestion, while simultaneously removing every obstacle to compliance. Dale came out the following Tuesday and was done by noon. 4 cameras, total front porch, back door driveway, and 1 small unit mounted high on the study bookshelf angled toward the desk and the filing cabinet beside it. Gerald said the study camera was standard practice for home offices with important documents. I agreed without thinking much about it. I had not thought much about it until 6 weeks later on a sleepless Thursday night, when I sat down to check whether the front porch light had been triggering motion alerts, and pulled up 3 months of footage instead. I had not been looking for anything specific. That is important to say clearly. I was an old man with insomnia scrolling through camera footage because it gave his mind something to do that wasn't grieving. And then I started noticing patterns. Delivery trucks, the mail carrier, my neighbor's dog who liked to sit on my bottom porch step for reasons I had never fully understood, and Colton, or rather the absence of Colton, and then the sudden presence of him on 5 specific dates, 5 times in 12 months. He had told Nora he checked on me regularly. He had told his sister Diane the same thing. He had told me once in a phone call, "I worry about you out there alone, Dad. I try to get by when I can." 5 times in 12 months, and 2 of those visits were to pick up his old snowblower and Helen's bread machine, which he had decided he wanted back. I sat with that number for a while. 5. Then I pulled up the study footage. The relevant recording was from a Tuesday in March. I had been in the habit of taking a long nap after lunch that month. The physical therapy for my knee was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated. A deep systemic fatigue that hit around 1 in the afternoon and didn't let go for 2 hours. Colton knew my schedule. He had asked about it the previous Christmas, the way people ask questions that seem like concern but are actually reconnaissance. On the recording, the study door opened at 1:47 in the afternoon. Colton came in. He moved directly to the filing cabinet beside the desk. No hesitation, no looking around, no moment of apparent uncertainty about where he was going or why. He opened the second drawer from the bottom. I watched him flip through the hanging folders with the focused efficiency of someone who had a specific target. He stopped. He pulled out a document. He held it up with his left hand and photographed it with his right. His phone screen flaring white in the dim room. He replaced the document, closed the drawer, and walked out. From entry to exit, 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The document in that drawer was my lease agreement with First National Bank for Safe Deposit Box 417. No account numbers. No inventory of contents. just the agreement itself with the box number printed clearly at the top. My son had photographed proof that the box existed. He did not know what was in it, but he had known since March that there was something worth looking for. I sat back in my chair. My knee ached in the low, persistent way it had been aching for 3 weeks, and I had a feeling in my chest that was not quite anger. It was older than anger and quieter. It was the feeling of watching something you had hoped was not true become undeniably, documentably true. 4 minutes, I said out loud to the empty room. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I picked up my phone and called Gerald. He answered on the second ring. "Russell, everything all right? I need to tell you something," I said. "And then I need you to tell me whether a name I found matches anything you know." A pause. "What did you find?" "A name," I said. "Written on a slip of paper tucked under my lease agreement in the study filing cabinet. Marcus Webb. I don't recognize it." The quality of Gerald's silence changed. It went from the ordinary quiet of a man listening to something more careful, more considered. "Where did you say you found that paper?" "Under the lease for the safe deposit box." "Russell," Gerald said slowly, "I need you to sit tight tonight. Don't call that number. Don't move anything in the study. I'm going to make some calls in the morning, and I think you should come to my office directly after." My hand tightened around the phone. "Gerald, do you know who Marcus Webb is?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Come to my office at 9, he said. "And bring the paper." Gerald's office smelled like old books and strong coffee, the same as it had for 30 years. He was waiting for me when I arrived at 5 minutes to 9, which told me whatever he had found, he had not slept particularly well finding it. He did not offer pleasantries. He sat down across from me, opened a manila folder, and placed a single printed sheet on the desk between us. "Marcus Webb," he said, "runs a small antiques and estate jewelry brokerage out of Philadelphia. Primarily operates online, but maintains a private client list. He specializes in evaluating pieces from estates, things families want to sell quietly without going through a major auction house." Gerald tapped the page. "I have a contact at a firm that occasionally works with him. I made a call last night." I looked at the printed sheet. It was an email. The sender address was one I recognized. It was the address Colton used for his business, the one printed on his shop's receipts and invoices. "Rate it," Gerald said. I read it. The email was dated February 19th of this year, 7 months ago. Colton had written to Marcus with what he described as an inquiry on behalf of his wife. He had attached an image. Gerald had printed it below the email text. It was a photograph of Helen's diamond bracelet. The photograph was taken from an angle I recognized immediately through the partially open door of my study. The bracelet visible inside the open safe deposit documentation folder where I had placed it temporarily during an insurance review 2 years prior. My son had photographed his mother's bracelet through the crack of my study door. Then he had sent it to the stranger in Philadelphia and asked what it was worth. The description in the email read, "Vintage white gold and diamond bracelet, approximately 1970s, excellent condition. Family piece. Asking on behalf of my wife, she's interested in having the stones repurposed into something more contemporary." He had used Nora's name. As cover, as explanation, as a reason that would make the inquiry sound sentimental rather than predatory. My hands were not steady when I set the paper down. I pressed them flat against my thighs and focused on keeping my breathing even. "Marcus Webb never replied," Gerald said quietly. I confirmed that. The inquiry went unanswered. "As though that changes what it was," I said. "No," Gerald agreed. It doesn't. I looked at the window behind Gerald's desk, the familiar view of the parking lot, the maple at the corner already starting to turn. Helen had loved this time of year. She had loved the specific amber of October light through turning leaves, had called it the most honest light of the year because it made everything look exactly as old as it was. He used Nora's name, I said. Yes. His own wife. He used her name to make it look like a gift inquiry. That's what the email says. I felt something move through my chest. Not pain, not rage, something older and colder than both. The grief of watching a person you raised become someone you don't recognize. I need to tell you something else, I said. Something I haven't told anyone. Gerald leaned back and folded his hands in his lap. He had the practiced patience of a man who had spent 30 years listening to families reveal the things they had been hiding from each other. Over the past 12 years, I said, I gave Colton money on 3 separate occasions. The first time was 2014. His shop was failing, he had overextended on inventory, and his main supplier called in a short-term debt. He came to me on a Sunday afternoon. He sat at my kitchen table and he cried, Gerald. He was 40 years old, and he put his face in his hands and cried like a boy, and I sat there, and I could not let him lose what he'd built. I stopped. $28,000. I transferred it directly to the business account. Gerald did not react. He waited. Second time was 2018, I said. He told me he owed back taxes from a filing error his accountant had made. $26,000. I didn't ask to see the documentation. I should have. I pressed my hands harder against my thighs. Third time was 2021. Another rough period for the shop. $18,000, $72,000 total across 12 years. Were these documented as loans or gifts? Gerald asked. His voice was professional, precise, non-judgmental. I kept my own records, I said. Dates, amounts, stated purposes. I never asked him to sign anything. I didn't want to humiliate him. Gerald nodded slowly. Does Nora know about any of this? That, I said, is the part that made me lose sleep. I exhaled. About 4 months ago, I was in the backyard when Colton was on the phone inside. He didn't know I could hear through the kitchen window. He was talking to someone, a friend, I think. And he said, and I remember the exact words, best sales quarter we've had in 3 years. Turned out the expansion was worth it. I always knew the inventory risk would pay off. Gerald's expression shifted barely, but I had known him long enough to read it. His jaw tightened a fraction. He told Nora the money was his, I said. $72,000 I gave him to keep his business alive, and he told his wife it was profit. He built his reputation as a self-made man on my savings and Helen's, and he let his wife believe it for 12 years. The room held that truth for a moment. When I tried to give Nora gas money after she drove Helen to Hershey, I said she refused. She told me she didn't need it. My voice came out rougher than I intended. My son took $72,000 and called it a bonus. His wife drove my dying wife through a snowstorm and wouldn't take $20 for gas. I felt my eyes sting and did not look away from Gerald's face. You tell me which one of them understood what family means. Gerald reached across the desk and placed his hand briefly over my forearm. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. What do you need from me, Russell? He asked when he removed his hand. I need to know, I said. If there's a way to make sure that when everything comes to light, and it will, nobody can say I was confused or manipulated or anything other than a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Gerald straightened in his chair. Then we start building that record today, he said. and we start with a full evaluation. I want to tell you about the bracelet before I tell you what the email said. Because without knowing what the bracelet meant, the email is just a document. With it, the email is something else entirely. Helen's mother came to this country from County Clare, Ireland in 1951 with $40, a cardboard suitcase, and a white gold bracelet her own mother had pressed into her hand at the dock in Cove. The bracelet was set with 7 small diamonds in a pavé band. Nothing extravagant by modern standards. Nothing that would stop you in a jewelry store window. But it was the only valuable thing Helen's mother brought from the life she left behind. And she wore it every day for 51 years until her hands swelled with arthritis and she could no longer get it over her knuckles. The day she gave it to Helen, she said, "This bracelet has been on the wrist of a woman who loved her family in every decade since the 1920s. Don't break the streak. Helen wore it the day we married. She wore it the day Colton was born, the day Diane was born, every Christmas morning, every anniversary dinner, every ordinary Tuesday. She felt like remembering who she came from. When she got sick and lost weight, and the bracelet slipped around her wrist too loosely to feel safe, she put it in the box herself. She said, 'I don't want to lose it in a hospital. Keep it with the rest.' I kept it with the rest." Gerald placed the printed email on the desk and waited while I read it. I read it twice. Then I set it down and stared at the image printed below the text. The photograph Colton had taken through the crack of my study door. The bracelet lying inside the open folder caught in the particular flat light of a camera phone. "He used Nora's name," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "He told this man Webb that his wife wanted the stones repurposed. That's what the email states," Gerald said carefully. "Nora has never asked for that bracelet." My hands pressed flat against my thighs. She has never mentioned it. She doesn't know what it meant to Helen's mother. She doesn't know where it came from. She wouldn't. I stopped. Started again. "She wouldn't do that, Gerald. That's not who she is." "See, I know," Gerald said. "And the email being unanswered suggests Webb either didn't have the capacity for the piece or had some question about the inquiry he didn't want to pursue. It doesn't matter that he didn't answer." I felt the sting hit my eyes and pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment, steadying myself. My son photographed his mother's bracelet through the crack of a door like a thief casing a property. Helen had been in the ground less than 6 years. That bracelet has been in our family for over 100 years, and he sent a picture of it to a stranger in Philadelphia and asked what the stones were worth. Gerald did not look away. He had the particular quality of good listeners. He absorbed what you gave him without flinching, without filling the space with reassurances that weren't true. "What do you want to do, Russell?" he asked. I looked at the window. The October light was coming through at a low angle the way it does in Pennsylvania in the fall, turning everything amber and slightly melancholy. Helen would have called it honest light. I called it the kind of light that makes you see things clearly whether you want to or not. "I want to make sure that bracelet never ends up in a stranger's hands," I said. "I want to make sure none of Helen's things end up that way. We can do that. And I want to make sure that when I make my decisions about all of it, the land, the jewelry, the accounts, nobody can walk into a courtroom and say I was confused." I turned back to Gerald. "He's going to push back, Gerald. When he finds out things aren't going the way he planned, he's going to say I didn't understand what I was signing. He's going to say someone influenced me. I know my son. I know how he operates when he's cornered." Gerald straightened. "Then we document everything before he has a reason to start pushing." He picked up his pen. "I want you to see your doctor this week. Full checkup. Ask specifically for a cognitive screening. Their routine, nothing alarming about requesting one, and the results become part of your medical record. And then you come back here and we sit down with someone I trust, who has no connection to your family whatsoever. A second attorney. She reviews everything independently, meets with you alone, and signs off on her own assessment. He held my gaze. When Colton challenges this, and I agree with you, he will, the record will show that two separate professionals, neither of whom had any reason to favor you, both concluded you were of sound mind and acting freely. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly, more like the particular steadiness of a man who has been holding himself very carefully for a long time and has finally found solid ground to stand on. All right, I said. Schedule it. I already have the referral pulled up, Gerald said. He turned his monitor toward me. Tuesday at 2, and Russell. He paused. Don't tell Colton you're doing this. Don't tell anyone except Nora, and only if you trust her completely. I trust her completely, I said without hesitation. Gerald nodded once. Then we start Tuesday. The week after I sat in Gerald's office, I made 3 appointments. None of them were with my son. Colton had called twice since that Tuesday, once to ask if I needed anything from the hardware store, once to mention he would be in the area on Thursday and could stop by. Both times I told him I was fine and thanked him for calling. Both times I heard the slight pause afterward, the recalibration, the sound of a man who expected more and wasn't sure what to do with less. I had been giving Colton more than he asked for his entire life. Apparently, the adjustment went both ways. The first appointment was with Dr. Emmett Carroll, who had been my physician for 22 years. Emmett was a tall, unhurried man from rural Georgia who had the good sense never to talk down to his patients and the better sense to ask the questions most doctors skip. I told him I wanted a full workup, cardiovascular, the knee follow-up, and a cognitive screening. He looked up from his notepad. Cognitive screening is routine for your age group, Russell. Nothing to read into it. But I want to ask, is there a specific reason you're requesting it now? Yes, I said. But it's personal. He held my gaze for a moment. Fair enough. He wrote the order. Results will be in your chart within a week. You'll have full access. The screening itself took 40 minutes. A series of questions, memory exercises, pattern recognition tasks, and a brief interview about my daily functioning. The woman who administered it was younger than Colton, brisk and professional, and she narrated nothing while I worked through it, which I appreciated. I did not want commentary. I wanted documentation. When Emmett called 4 days later, he said, "Everything looks normal, Russell. Cognitive function is well within the expected range for your age. Honestly, you performed better than average on the processing speed portion." He sounded pleased in the quiet way doctors sound pleased when they don't have bad news to deliver. "I'll note the results in your chart." "Can I get a written summary?" I asked. "I'll have the front desk prepare one. You can pick it up Thursday." The second appointment was back at Gerald's office, a longer session than usual, going through every document I had, the land deeds, the safe deposit lease, the property management contracts, my existing will, the beneficiary designations on my life insurance and retirement accounts. Gerald walked me through each one with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the difference between an airtight plan and a contested one was often a single unsigned line or an outdated form. "Your current will leaves everything equally to Colton and Diane," he said, setting it on the desk between us. "Is that still your intention?" "No," I said. "It hasn't been for a while. I just hadn't done anything about it." "What do you want it to say?" I told him. I did not rush through it. I had been thinking about this for longer than I had admitted to myself, and the words came out clearly in the right order, the way words do when they've been living in your head long enough to know their own shape. When I finished, Gerald set down his pen and looked at me. That's going to surprise some people. I imagine it will, I said. Colton in particular. I imagine that too. Are you prepared for his response? I thought about a boy of 9 years old who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms because he was frightened of the sound. I thought about a man of 44 who had photographed his mother's bracelet through a crack in my door and sent the image to a stranger. I thought about the distance between those two people and the years it had taken to travel it. I've been preparing for a long time, I said. The third appointment was the one Gerald had arranged a meeting with an attorney named Patricia Wohl, who operated a small estate practice in Ephrata. I had never met her. She had no connection to my family, no history with Gerald's firm beyond a professional referral network, and no reason to view my situation through any lens other than the one her training gave her. She met me alone. No Gerald, no Nora, no one. Just Patricia Wohl, 70 years old herself, silver-haired with reading glasses on a chain, and the calm, measured manner of someone who had spent decades watching families argue over things that mattered and things that didn't. She reviewed my documents for 90 minutes. She asked me questions about the property management arrangement, about the safe deposit box, about my reasons for the changes I intended to make. She did not lead my answers. She wrote everything down in longhand in a yellow legal pad the old-fashioned way, and when she finished, she looked at me over her glasses. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "in my professional judgment, you are fully competent to make these decisions. You understand the nature and extent of your assets, the identity of the people who would naturally expect to inherit from you, and the consequences of the choices you are making. I'll prepare a written assessment and have it to Gerald's office by Friday." I thanked her. She stood to shake my hand, and then she said something I hadn't expected. "Can I ask you something that isn't strictly professional?" "Go ahead." "How long have you been carrying this alone?" I thought about it honestly. 6 years, I said, "since Helen died." She nodded. "Well," she said, and her voice was quiet, "it sounds like you've found someone to help you carry it now." I drove home in the thin October afternoon light. When I pulled into my driveway, there was a text message on my phone from Colton. It read, "Hey Dad, haven't heard from you." "Everything okay?" I read it twice. Set the phone on the passenger seat. Looked at my front door, the yellow maple in the yard, the frost-edged edge of the second porch step, where Nora had warned me to be careful on a morning that felt like a different season entirely. Then I went inside without answering. Before I tell you what my son did next, drop the word key in the comments right now. Just that one word. Let me know you're still here. Some details ahead are fictional shaped to carry something true. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, step away now. But if you stay, you won't regret it. October arrived the way it always does in Lancaster. Quietly, at first the maples turning before you notice the mornings getting that particular bite that makes you glad for the weight of a good jacket. Then one morning I woke up to find my son's truck in my driveway before 8 o'clock. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and looked at it for a moment. A dark blue Ford F-150, the same truck Colton had driven for 4 years, parked at the curb with the engine still ticking. He was already on the front porch by the time I got to the door, holding a paper bag from the bakery on Prince Street and wearing the careful expression of a man who has rehearsed his entrance. "Say, morning, Dad." He held up the bag. "Picked up some of those cinnamon rolls you like? The ones from Muller's?" I opened the door wider and let him in. "I haven't been to Muller's in 2 years," I said. He set the bag on the kitchen table without missing a beat. "Well, they're still good. Trust me." He pulled out a chair and sat down like he owned the room, the way Colton always moved through spaces with the comfortable authority of a man who assumed he was welcome everywhere he went. How's the knee? You look like you're moving better. I am moving better, I said. I poured a second mug of coffee and set it in front of him. What brings you by on a Thursday morning? Can't a guy check on his father? You can, I said. You haven't particularly, but you can. That landed. His jaw tightened for just a moment, a small involuntary clench, before the easy smile came back. Dad, come on. I've been busy. The shop's been a lot lately. I know, I said. I sat down across from him. How is the shop? And good. Really good, actually. He tore off a piece of the cinnamon roll and chewed. We picked up a new supplier out of Reading. Good margin. Things are finally moving in the right direction. I watched him eat and thought about a Tuesday in March and 4 minutes and 11 seconds of camera footage. I thought about a February email and a photograph taken through a crack in a door. I thought about a boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard because he thought they were flowers worth keeping. That's good, I said. I'm glad the shop is well. We sat like that for a while, him talking about the business, a supplier deal, a renovation he was thinking about doing to the storefront. I asked questions when questions seemed natural. I listened. I let him believe the visit was working. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the fourth morning, he had stopped bringing food and started bringing utility bills, holding them up with the expression of a man performing helpfulness. Dad, your electric seems high this month. You want me to call the company, see if there's a better rate? The fifth morning, he asked if I had thought about having someone look at the furnace before winter. The sixth morning, he mentioned almost casually that he knew a financial advisor who specialized in estate planning for older adults. I said, I already have Gerald. Gerald's great, Colton said too quickly. But he's been doing things the same way for 30 years, Dad. There might be better options now, more efficient structures. I'm happy with what I have, I said. He pivoted without pausing. Actually, there's something I've been meaning to bring up. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded set of papers. He set them on the table between us with the practiced casualness of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and decided this was it. It's just a precaution, a power of attorney. It lets me step in and help manage things if you ever need it. Finances, real property, the accounts. Nothing happens unless you need me. Think of it as insurance. In Pennsylvania, a durable power of attorney is a legal document that grants another person called the agent the authority to make financial and legal decisions on your behalf. It can be written to take effect immediately or only under specific conditions. The one Colton had placed in front of me was pre-filled with his name as agent, and the language in the operative clause was not conditional. It would have given him immediate, unrestricted access to every account, every asset, and every piece of real property attached to my name. I picked it up, read it through once. Slowly, the way Gerald had taught me to read documents, looking for what wasn't said as much as what was. Then I set it down. I'll think about it, I said. Colton leaned forward. Dad, it's really just common sense. After the surgery with the knee still healing, you want to make sure there's somebody who can act fast if something happens. You're right that I want someone who can act fast, I said. That's why I have Gerald. Gerald isn't family. No, I agreed. He isn't. I picked up my coffee mug. Leave the papers. I'll look them over. He left them. He left satisfied, which was what I needed him to do. When he was gone, I took the power of attorney to my study and placed it in the second drawer of the filing cabinet directly in front of the camera lens. Then I called Gerald. He brought paperwork, I said. What kind? Durable POA. Immediate effect. Full authority over accounts and real property. Gerald exhaled slowly. Did you sign it? Of course not. Good. A pause. Russell, keep that document exactly where it is. Don't return it to him. Don't destroy it. We may need it later to show a pattern of behavior. I already put it in the filing cabinet, I said. A brief quiet. Then, in front of the camera. In front of the camera, I confirmed. I heard what might have been a quiet laugh from Gerald's end of the line. Good man, he said. I told the woman from Keystone Realty that she had the wrong number and hung up. Then I stood in my kitchen for a long time, holding the phone against my chest, staring at the refrigerator where Helen had kept a magnetic notepad for grocery lists that I had never taken down. That call had come the evening after Colton's 7th consecutive morning visit. A woman named Linda Marsh, pleasant and professional, who had asked whether Mr. Dalton was available to discuss the timeline for the remaining balance on the Clearview Drive property. When I said I didn't know what she was referring to, she apologized, said she would follow up with my son directly, and ended the call with practiced efficiency. I did not call Gerald that night. I needed to think first. Clearview Drive was in a new development east of Lancaster, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were large and the lots were small, and everything looked recently constructed and slightly expensive. I had driven through it once the previous spring and thought it was the kind of place where people moved when they wanted to signal that they had arrived somewhere. It was not a neighborhood for someone running a mid-sized retail shop on a good margin from a new supplier in Reading, unless they were planning to pay for it with money that wasn't theirs yet. 3 days after the Keystone Realty call, a Tuesday morning in early November, I heard a car door close in front of my house and looked out to see my neighbor Dorothy Patterson crossing the lawn in her heavy coat, carrying a foil-covered plate. Dorothy was 74, sharp-eyed, and constitutionally incapable of delivering food without delivering information alongside it. I opened the door before she knocked. Russell, she held out the plate. Banana bread. Don't argue. I wasn't planning to, I said. Come in. She sat at my kitchen table and accepted a cup of tea with the focused satisfaction of a woman who had been looking for an excuse to come over. She talked about her granddaughter's school play, about the frost damage to her chrysanthemums, about the new family that had moved into the Hendersons' old house. Then she set her mug down and looked at me directly. I want to tell you something, she said, and I want you to know it comes from a good place. All right, I said. I ran into your son at the gas station last week, on Route 30. She folded her hands around her mug. We chatted for a few minutes. I don't know how to say this exactly, he was talking about you in a way that felt off to me. My chest went tight. Off how, he said. She stopped, pressed her lips together, choosing her words. He said he was worried about you, that your daughter-in-law had been spending a lot of time at your house and that he wasn't sure you were getting objective advice about your affairs. He used the word influenced. She met my eyes steadily. He said, I'm not sure Dad's decisions are really his own lately. The kitchen felt very still around that sentence. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator hummed its ordinary hum. He said that, I said. He did. And I thought you should know because... Dorothy's voice went firm in the way the voices of certain older women go firm, like iron under velvet. Because I have watched that daughter-in-law of yours come to this house in rain and cold and heat for years. I have seen her carry things up your front steps. I have seen her sit in her car in your driveway for 2 hours waiting to drive you somewhere. And the idea that she is the problem in this situation. She stopped herself, picked up her mug. Well, I just thought you should know what's being said. I looked at my hands on the table. They were not steady. Nora had driven Helen to chemotherapy in February snowstorms. Nora had sat with me in the emergency room in 2022 when my blood pressure spiked and Colton had been unreachable for 6 hours. Nora had fixed the loose handrail on my back steps because she noticed it was loose and did not wait to be asked. She had done all of it without telling anyone, without keeping score, without once suggesting that her presence entitled her to anything. And my son had stood at a gas station on Route 30 and told my neighbor that she was the dangerous one. "Dorothy," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped along the edges. "Thank you for telling me." "Of course." She smoothed her coat. "The banana bread is good for 3 days. After that, it gets dense." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Russell, whatever he's doing, don't let him make you doubt what you know." She held my gaze. "You've always known people, Russell. Trust that." She let herself out. I sat at the table for a long time after she left. The banana bread was still on the counter, still covered in foil, and I looked at it without seeing it. I was thinking about the word influenced. In elder law, undue influence is a specific legal concept. It refers to a situation in which someone uses a position of trust or power to override another person's free will, particularly in matters of estate planning or financial decisions. It is one of the primary grounds used to contest a will or challenge a legal document after the fact. My son had not used the term accidentally. He had planted it deliberately in a casual conversation at a gas station in the ear of a neighbor who would eventually repeat it. He was building a narrative. Quietly, conversationally, with the patience of a man who understood that the most effective groundwork is the kind nobody notices being laid. I picked up my phone, called Nora. She answered on the second ring. "Russell, is everything okay? I need to ask you something," I said. "Has Colton said anything to you lately about me, about my affairs?" A pause. Longer than a simple no would require. "Russell." Her voice shifted, dropped half a register. "I need to tell you something. About a phone call I received last week." My grip on the phone tightened. "Go ahead." A woman called," she said. "From a real estate office, Keystone Realty. She asked for Mr. Dalton. She meant Colton, I think. And when I said he wasn't available, she apologized and said she would follow up about the Clearview Drive property." Another pause. "Russell, I looked it up. Clearview Drive is a new development east of the city. The houses there start at $890,000. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the maple dropped a leaf against the kitchen window. How was he planning to pay for it?" I asked, though I already understood the answer forming in both our minds. "I asked him," Nora said, and her voice had gone the way voices go when a person is working hard to hold themselves together. "He said it was an investment opportunity. He said he had a partner. When I pushed him, he changed the subject." A sharp intake of breath. "Russell, I don't think there's a partner." "No," I said. "I don't think there is either." She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of what they feel they're willing to let out. "Then, he was going to use your estate to pay for a house he hasn't told his wife about." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough to hear. "Our house. He was going to use money you haven't even—" She stopped. "Nora," I said, "I'm okay." She wasn't, not entirely, but she steadied herself audibly the way she always did, not by pushing the feeling down, but by standing very still inside it until it passed. "What do you need me to do?" Nothing yet, I said. But I need you to come by Thursday and bring the key. What Nora told me that night, she hadn't meant to tell me yet. I could hear it in the way she spoke carefully, at first measuring each sentence, before releasing it like a woman walking across ice she wasn't sure would hold. She had received the call from Linda Marsh at Keystone Realty on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks before she told me about it. She had been at her desk at the physical therapy clinic halfway through an insurance authorization form when her cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Linda Marsh introduced herself, pleasantly asked for Mr. Dalton, and when Nora said her husband wasn't available, Linda said she'd follow up directly and thanked her for her time. Professional, brief, unremarkable, except that Nora wrote down the name of the company before she forgot it. I almost didn't look it up, she told me over the phone. Her voice had steadied since the beginning of our call, but I could still hear the effort it cost her to keep it that way. The slight compression in her breath, the way certain words came out flatter than she intended. I almost told myself it was nothing, some kind of solicitation. But I wrote it down, and that night I looked up Keystone Realty, and then I looked up what they actually sell. Clearview Drive, I said. Clearview Drive, she confirmed. I found the development's website, the floor plans, the price range. A pause. Russell, the smallest unit in that development, starts at $840,000. The ones with 4 bedrooms start at over $1 million. I said nothing. I let her continue. I went through our joint account that same night, she said. Colton and I have a shared checking account. We've always kept it that way. Both our paychecks go in, all the household expenses come out. I went through 6 months of statements. Her voice tightened. 3 months ago, $45,000 was transferred out to an account I didn't recognize. No memo, no explanation. Just gone. In Pennsylvania, real estate earnest money, sometimes called a good faith deposit, is typically 1 to 3% of the purchase price submitted when a buyer enters into a purchase agreement to demonstrate serious intent. On a property valued at one point, $2 million, $45,000 represented just under 4%. Enough to hold the property. Enough to make the agreement binding. Not enough to close without a substantial additional payment, a payment Colton did not have. I asked him about it, Nora said. That same night, I showed him the statement. She exhaled a sharp, controlled breath, the kind you use when you're trying not to cry in front of someone even when that someone can't see you. He said it was an investment opportunity, a private deal with a business contact. He said I wouldn't understand the structure of it. What did you say? I said, what's the contact's name? Her voice hardened at the edges. He said it was complicated. I said, give me a name, Colton. He said I was being paranoid. I said $45,000 disappeared from our account, and you won't tell me where it went. That's not paranoia, that's a question. She stopped. He left the room. He came back an hour later and told me he had a supplier from Reading who was getting into residential development, and it was a limited partnership opportunity. He said he'd explain the whole thing when the details were finalized. And you believed him? I asked. Not with judgment, I genuinely wanted to know. I believed that he believed I would stop asking, she said. Which isn't the same thing. Another pause, longer this time, waited with something she was deciding whether to say. Russell, I've been going back through the last 3 years. Little things that didn't add up at the time. A bonus he mentioned that I never saw in the account. A supplier payment that came in larger than expected. Business wins that never quite materialized into the stability you'd expect them to. Her voice dropped lower, the way voices drop when a person arrives at a truth they've been circling for a while, and finally decides to land on it. He's been telling me a story about who he is for a long time. I just didn't know I was only getting one version. My throat tightened. I thought about sitting in Gerald's office and saying the words, $72,000. I thought about the way those words had sounded factual, simple, devastating. Nora, I said carefully, there are things I need to tell you. Not tonight, there's too much, and you need to hear it properly, with documents in front of you. But I need you to know that what you've been finding is not the beginning of the story. Her breath caught. How much of it don't I know? Enough, I said. Come by Thursday. Gerald will be there. Bring the key. Russell. Her voice broke on the second syllable of my name just slightly, just enough to tell me how hard she was working to hold herself together. Is it bad? I thought about what honest answer to give her. It's clarifying, I said finally. Some things that didn't make sense are going to make sense. That's painful, but it's better than not knowing. She was quiet for a moment. Not the avoidant quiet of someone who has nothing to say, but the full quiet of someone absorbing something they already felt coming. Okay, she said. Thursday. I'll bring the key. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The grocery list notepad on the refrigerator caught my eye. The one in Helen's handwriting, last updated the week before she went into the hospital for the final time. Milk. Oranges. The good coffee, not the store brand. Small, ordinary things written in the hand of a woman who had assumed she would be around to need them. I had built everything in this house around the assumption of her presence. And she had been gone for 6 years, and my son had spent those 6 years calculating what he could take from what she and I had built together. I pressed my hand flat against the kitchen table and felt the grain of the wood beneath my palm. Solid. Real. Mine. Thursday, I thought. Thursday, we finish this. Thursday morning, Nora arrived at Gerald's office before I did. She was sitting in the waiting with her coat still on, and the brass key in her right hand, not inside her pocket, where I had told her to keep it, but held openly in her palm, turning it over and over the way people handle things they've been thinking about too much. She looked up when I came through the door, and the expression on her face was the particular expression of a person who has spent several sleepless nights arriving somewhere they're not sure they want to be. You look tired, I said. I am tired, she said. I've been awake since 4. She stood and pocketed the key. Gerald's ready, he said whenever you arrived. Gerald met us in the doorway of his inner office and shook Nora's hand with the quiet formality he reserved for situations where formality was a kindness. Mrs. Dalton, thank you for coming. He looked at me. Ready? Ready, I said. The 3 of us drove to First National Bank in Gerald's car. Gerald had called ahead. The branch manager was expecting us. The paperwork was prepared. The process would be smooth. In Pennsylvania, a safe deposit box can be accessed by the box holder or by any person the holder has designated in writing on the bank's authorization form. The previous morning, Gerald had driven me to the branch himself, so I could sign the authorization form directly at the counter my signature witnessed by a bank officer adding Nora's name to the access record. Everything done in person, everything done correctly. The bank employee, a young woman named Stephanie, who moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood her job, was to facilitate and not to observe, led us through the secured door down the corridor that smelled of recycled air and industrial carpet, and into the private viewing room. She brought out box 417, set it on the table, and left us alone. I looked at Nora. You open it, I said. She looked at the key in her hand. Why me? Because I want you to see what's in there without my hands being the ones that open it, I said. I want it to be yours from the first moment." Her jaw worked for a second. Then she inserted the key, turned it, and lifted the lid. The interior of the box was lined with dark felt. Arranged carefully inside were 3 small velvet pouches, deep green, the color Helen had always associated with her mother's side of the family. Beside them, a flat envelope containing the property deeds, the management contracts, and the appraisal documentation. And beneath everything, a larger manila envelope in my handwriting, sealed with a strip of packing tape, and labeled in the way I label things I intend to last clearly without flourish. Nora reached for the velvet pouches first instinctively. She opened the smallest one and tipped it gently into her palm. Helen's wedding band slid out plain gold worn smooth on the inner surface from 41 years of daily wear. Nora's hand closed around it immediately, her fingers curling inward like she was trying to keep something from escaping. "Russell," she said, and her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "The middle pouch has the bracelet," I said. "The large one has the necklace and earrings." She opened the middle pouch. The bracelet caught the fluorescent light of the viewing room and scattered it in 7 small points across the ceiling. Nora stared at it for a long moment, her lips pressed together, her shoulders rigid with the effort of not falling apart in a bank. "This is the bracelet from the email," she said. "Yes." She set it carefully back in the pouch and looked at me with eyes that were red at the rims and absolutely clear at the center. "He photographed this." "He did." "While you were sleeping." "While I was sleeping," I confirmed. She pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed through her nose for several seconds. Gerald looked at the table. I let her have the moment without filling it. When she lowered her hands, she had composed herself, not by pushing the feeling down, but by placing it somewhere she could carry it. She was built that way. I had always known it. "Tell me about the land," she said. Her voice was steady again, deliberate. Gerald took over. He explained the property management structure, the 3 parcels, the rental income, the current combined valuation of $1.1 million. He explained that a formal purchase offer had been received and that the decision of whether and when to sell remained entirely with me. He explained the proposed changes to my estate plan, the charitable trust for senior services in Lancaster County, the fixed amount designated for Diane, the adjusted portion for Colton, that would account for the $72,000 previously received. Then he said, "Russell has designated you as successor trustee." Nora turned to me. "What does that mean exactly?" "A successor trustee," Gerald said, "is the person who administers a trust after the original trustee in this case. Russell is no longer able to do so either because of incapacity or death. The trustee's job is not to benefit from the trust. It is to carry out the instructions of the trust document faithfully and accurately on behalf of the beneficiaries." He paused. "You would not receive any distribution from this estate. You would receive no money, no property, no jewelry. You would receive a legal responsibility and a set of written instructions." Nora absorbed that. "Colton thinks I'm getting everything." "Yes," I said. "And you're letting him think that. For now." She looked at the velvet pouches, the envelope, the neat stack of documents Gerald had laid out beside the box. Then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully name, something between grief and steadiness, between the weight of what she now knew and the particular dignity of a woman who has been trusted with something real. "Shah Russell," she said. "If I do this, if I agree to this, he's going to come after me, harder than he already has." "I know," I said. "And when he does, there will be documentation showing that you were not present for any of the decisions made in this room or in Gerald's office. There will be a record from 2 independent professionals confirming that I made every choice freely, clearly, and without anyone's influence. I held her gaze. He will have nothing real to point to, only the story he's already been building. And that story is going to fall apart in front of people who know better. She picked up Helen's wedding band again, held it in her closed fist. A single tear escaped the corner of her right eye, and she pressed the back of her wrist against her cheek without letting go of the ring. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." Gerald uncapped his pen. "Then let's make it official." Diane drove in from Philadelphia on a Wednesday afternoon, which told me immediately that whatever she had to say, she hadn't slept well deciding whether to say it. My daughter lived 47 miles away. In 23 years, she had made that drive spontaneously exactly twice, once when Helen was first admitted to the hospital, and once the morning after I called to tell her that her mother had died. Every other visit had been scheduled, calendared, announced 2 weeks in advance, with the particular efficiency of a woman who ran her life like a project she was determined to deliver on time. Diane showing up unannounced on a Wednesday meant something had broken through her system of management. She knocked instead of using the spare key. I noticed that too. I opened the door before her knuckles finished their second knock. She was standing on the porch with her coat unbuttoned, despite the cold. Her dark hair, the same dark hair Helen had, the kind that goes silver at the temples, first pulled back in a way that suggested she had redone it in the car. Her face was tight around the jaw, the way faces get when a person has been holding something in long enough that it has started to press back. "Dad," she said. "Come in," I said. "I'll put on coffee." She followed me to the kitchen and sat down at the table without taking off her coat. I set the kettle on and got down 2 mugs, and when I turned around, she had placed her phone face up on the table between us. The screen was lit, showing an open email. "Before I say anything else," she said, "I need you to read that." I sat down across from her and picked up the phone. The email was from Colton's address, sent to Gerald Hatch's office in October, 2 weeks after Russell had refused to sign the power of attorney. The subject line read, "Concern regarding father's decision-making capacity." The body of the email stated that both Colton and Diane had discussed the matter at length and were in agreement that their father's recent decisions might not reflect his full understanding of his financial situation. It went on to request a meeting with Gerald to discuss appropriate next steps, including the possibility of a formal capacity evaluation initiated by the family. Diane's name appeared 3 times, each time presented as though she had contributed to the email's composition, as though she had read it, agreed with it, and endorsed it. She had done none of those things. I set the phone down carefully. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. "When did you find out about this?" "8 days ago," she said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. I could hear the heat underneath it, the kind of heat that comes from anger that has had over a week to become something more focused and more cold. "A friend of mine, she's an attorney in Philadelphia, does estate work," she called me, and asked if I was aware that my name was appearing in correspondence related to my father's estate. She had heard about it through a professional contact. She was asking as a courtesy. Diane's jaw tightened. "I had no idea, Dad. I didn't know that email existed. I never told Colton I agreed with any of it. I never said your decisions were questionable. I never said anything of the kind." Did you call him?" I asked. "I called him the same night." Her hands pressed flat on the table, fingers spread like she needed to feel something solid. "He said he was acting in the family's best interest. He said he was protecting you. I told him he had used my name without my permission in a legal document, and he said—" She stopped, swallowed. "He said I was being oversensitive. that I knew what he meant, and I was just looking for a reason to make things difficult. I watched my daughter's face cycle through something, the particular expression of a person realizing that a pattern they have been excusing for years has a name they have been avoiding giving it. "Diane," I said, "how much did he tell you about Nora before you found out about the email?" She looked at the table. Her fingers curled inward. "He told me she had taken over, that she was always at your house, that she had inserted herself into your affairs, and that you weren't getting objective advice." She looked up at me, and her eyes were red at the edges. Though she wasn't crying yet, she was the kind of woman who cried after privately, when no one could read anything into it. He made it sound like she had been maneuvering for years, and she pressed her lips together. I believed him, because he's my brother, and because it was easier than coming back here and seeing for myself. "And now," I said. She exhaled slowly, pressing her palms harder against the table. "Now I drove 47 miles on a Wednesday because I needed to look at you and tell you that I'm sorry. For the email, for not coming sooner, for letting Colton be the one who described your life to me, instead of coming here and seeing it with my own eyes." Her voice cracked on the last sentence, just the single fracture of a woman who doesn't permit herself many. "I left everything for Colton because he was closer. Then I blamed him when it didn't get done, and all along I was the one who made the choice to stay away." She met my eyes. "That's on me, Dad. Not on him. Not on Nora. On me." The kitchen was very still around those words. Outside, the wind came through the maple and set the bare branches moving against the gray sky. "You're here now?" I said. "I'm here now," she agreed. Her chin trembled once before she controlled it. "What do you need me to do?" I looked at my daughter, really looked the way you look at someone you love and have been worried about without quite admitting it. "Right now, nothing. Just be honest if someone asks you directly whether you endorsed that email." "I'll do more than be honest," she said. "I'll say it out loud in front of whoever needs to hear it whenever you need me to." I nodded. "That's enough." She finally unzipped her coat, accepted the coffee I pushed toward her, wrapped both hands around the mug, and sat with the warmth of it for a moment. Then she looked up and asked, "Dad, has Colton mentioned a number to you about the land?" "A specific figure." I went very still. "What number did he give you?" 2.8 million, she said. "He mentioned it on the phone last week. Casual, like I already knew. He said the land had appreciated and the figure was around 2.8 million. She frowned. "I didn't know about any land. I thought you sold it years ago." I looked at my daughter steadily. "That number hasn't been made public, Diane. It came in a letter addressed to me." She stared. "He told me he'd heard it somewhere." "He read it," I said. "Somewhere it wasn't his to read." The color left her face. She set her mug down. Her mouth opened and closed once before she found the words. "Dad," she said. "What is he doing?" I looked at the window, at the bare maple, at the particular flat gray of a Pennsylvania November sky. "Exactly what I've been watching him do," I said, "for longer than either of us wants to admit." The formal offer on the land arrived the same week Diane drove back to Philadelphia. Gerald called me the morning after a Thursday early enough that I was still on my first cup of coffee, and his voice had that particular measured calm that meant something significant had happened, and he was deciding how to present it. "The offer came in yesterday afternoon," he said, "through the property management company forwarded to my office. A development group called Keystone Commercial Partners. They're the primary contractor for the new Route 222 commercial corridor that was approved in September. They want all three parcels, Millbrook Road Junction Lane and the Clearview corridor piece. I set my coffee mug down. What's the figure? $2.8 million, Gerald said. Combined. All cash, standard commercial closing timeline, 30 days to execute the purchase agreement. I sat with that number for a moment. $2.8 million for 3 pieces of land Helen and I had bought for a combined total of less than $90,000 over 3 decades. Land that had sat and grown and been tended by a management company and a series of quiet tenant farmers, while my son assumed it had been sold to pay for his mother's final months. Has this offer been circulated anywhere? I asked. Any public filing, any notice that would make the figure accessible? No, Gerald said. The offer was submitted directly through the management company to my office. The only document bearing that number that left my office was the copy I mailed to you last week. Standard letter addressed to your home. I thought about that letter. I had found it on my desk 3 weeks prior. The seal re-adhered with a faint ridge along the fold that I had initially dismissed. I had lived in that house for 31 years. Humidity does not leave a ridge that runs perfectly straight. Someone had opened it, read it, and pressed it back closed. I thought about Diane sitting at my kitchen table telling me Colton had mentioned $2.8 million on the phone casual like he had always known it. I thought about the envelope I had found on my desk 3 weeks prior, the one I had assumed I had opened myself during a drowsy evening and simply not remembered. The seal had been re-adhered with a faint ridge along the edge that I had attributed to humidity. I had lived in that house for 31 years. I knew what humidity did to envelope seams, and it did not leave a ridge that ran perfectly straight along the fold. Gerald, I said. My son has been reading my mail. A pause. That's a serious allegation. It's a serious observation, I said. The figure hasn't been filed anywhere. It came to my address in a sealed envelope. Diane told me Colton mentioned it to her last week, as though it were common knowledge. The only way he knows that number is if he opened a letter addressed to me and read it. Gerald was quiet for long enough that I could hear him thinking the particular quality of silence that belongs to a man working through implications. In Pennsylvania, he said finally, tampering with another person's mail is a federal offense. It's prosecuted under Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1708. I'm not suggesting you pursue that avenue. I'm saying that if Colton raises the figure publicly, he exposes himself to questions about how he obtained it. I know, I said. That's why I'm going to let him talk. Another pause. Russell, the birthday party. He called my office last week to confirm the venue for your 80th. He's planning something significant. I know that too. I picked up my coffee mug again and looked out the kitchen window at the frost on the lawn, the bare maple, the gray sky that had been sitting over Lancaster for 2 weeks without committing to either rain or clearing. He's been building toward something since October. The daily visits, the power of attorney, the pressure on Diane, the narrative about Nora. All of it has been moving toward a moment where he thinks he can force my hand in front of people who matter. And you're going to let him create that moment, Gerald said. It was not a question. I'm going to let him choose his own stage, I said. The birthday party is his idea, his guest list, his timing. Whatever he says in that room, he'll have chosen to say in front of witnesses. I set the mug down. I just need to make sure the record is complete before we get there. What do you need? Everything documented and signed, I said. The trust amendments, the successor trustee designation, the charitable allocation. All of it final and filed before the party. I can have everything executed by the 15th, Gerald said. That gives us 3 weeks before the birthday. Good. I paused. And Gerald, the offer. Don't respond yet. Let it sit. How long? I thought about 3 parcels of land Helen and I had walked through on autumn afternoons, talking about the future. In the way young people talk about it, as though it is a country, you will definitely visit a place you have already half built in your imagination. I thought about the way she had stood on the Millbrook Road parcel in October of 1989, the leaves just turning her hand in mine, and said, "Russell, this is the one. This is the one we keep." We had kept all 3. Until after the party, I said. Then we respond. Gerald said he would make the arrangements. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my empty mug and thought about Colton calling Diane to mention 2.8 million, the way you mentioned something you've been sitting on long enough that it started to feel like yours. He had opened a letter addressed to his father. He had read a number that wasn't his to know. He had carried it around for weeks, running calculations. I didn't want to imagine planning a party where he intended to use it as leverage. He had not considered the possibility that the number could cut both ways. I stood up, rinsed my mug at the sink, and thought about a Thursday in January 6 weeks away, when my son would stand up in a room full of people who knew us both and say something he believed would give him power over me. I thought about what would happen when those same people learned how he had come to know what he knew. The maple in the front yard had dropped its last leaves by then, the branches clean and bare against the sky. In the spring, it would come back the way it always did, steady, patient, the same tree it had always been, indifferent to whatever had happened while it waited. I had a great deal in common with that maple. I picked up the phone and called Nora. "The offer came in," I said when she answered. 2.8 million. She breathed out slowly. "Russell, that's—" "I know," I said. "We're not moving on it yet. But I wanted you to know." I paused. "And Nora, however the party goes, whatever Colton does or says in that room, I need you there." "I'll be there," she said without hesitating. "Good," I said. "Bring the key." Colton called it a family meeting. He arrived with a folder, which is never a good sign. I had known it was coming. Not the specific Tuesday evening, not the specific folder, but the shape of it, the inevitability of it. Colton had been building toward a confrontation since October, and a man who builds toward something with that much patience and that little self-awareness eventually arrives at a moment he has mistaken for his advantage. He called me Sunday evening, very pleasant, very casual, and said he thought it might be good for all of us to sit down together. Just the family. Clear the air. He mentioned that Diane was coming, which told me he had not yet spoken to her since her Wednesday drive to Lancaster. He arrived at 6 o'clock, with the folder under his arm, and the expression of a man who has rehearsed his opening statement and is confident in his material. Diane was already there. She had arrived 30 minutes earlier at my request, which meant she had been sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee and steeling herself for 25 minutes by the time her brother walked through the door. Nora came in behind Colton. She had not been invited. He turned when he heard her behind him, and something moved across his face, a quick recalculation there and gone. "I didn't know you were coming," he said. "Your father asked me," Nora said. Her voice was level. Her coat was still on. She walked past him and sat down at the far end of the table without waiting to be directed. Colton looked at me. I gestured to the chair across from Diane. "Sit down, Colton." He sat. He placed the folder on the table but did not open it, yet a man saving his material for the right moment. He looked around the table with the manufactured warmth of someone beginning a presentation he has run through in the mirror. "I appreciate you all being here," he said. "I know we've had some tension lately, and I think it's important that we talk through things as a family." He paused. "Dad, I want to start by saying that everything I've done because I love you, and I want to make sure you're protected." "Protected from what?" Diane asked. Her voice was pleasant in the way that a flat surface is pleasant, smooth, with nothing to grip. Colton glanced at her. "From making decisions under pressure. From people who might have an interest in influencing those decisions." He did not look at Nora directly. He did not need to. Nora's hands were folded on the table in front of her. I watched her knuckles whiten slightly, and then release. She said nothing. She was letting me run this. Colton opened the folder. Inside was a set of documents, a medical power of attorney pre-filled with his name and Diane's listed as co-agents. In Pennsylvania, a medical power of attorney authorizes designated individuals to make healthcare decisions on behalf of a person who becomes incapacitated. It is separate from a financial POA, and it requires the signature of the principal along with 2 witnesses who are not named as agents in the document. "Oh, this is just a precaution," Colton said, sliding the papers toward me. "Healthcare decisions. If something happens and you can't speak for yourself, Diane and I can step in. It's standard. Every attorney recommends it." "I already have those documents," I said. "Filed with Gerald's office." Colton nodded patiently. "Right. But Gerald made those, independently. Diane and I weren't part of the conversation." He glanced at his sister. "We thought it made sense to have something that reflects the whole family." Diane looked at the documents. Then she looked at her brother. "Who did you name in the version you filed with Gerald, Dad?" "Not Colton," I said. Colton's jaw tightened. "Dad, I named Gerald as my primary healthcare proxy," I said. "With Patricia Wohl as secondary. Both of them have copies. Both of them have reviewed my medical records and spoken with my physician." "Those people aren't family," Colton said, and his voice had shifted. The manufactured warmth was thinning at the edges, the way thin ice sounds different from thick ice when you press it. "No," I agreed. "They aren't. But they're people whose judgment hasn't given me reason to question it." Colton leaned forward. His voice dropped the way voices drop when a man is deciding whether to say the thing he has been saving. "Dad, I'm worried about you. The decisions you've been making lately don't look like you. The changes to the estate, the meetings with attorneys I've never heard of, the involvement of people who shouldn't be involved." He looked directly at Nora for the first time. "She's been in your house, your papers, your finances. She's not your family." Nora looked back at him without flinching. Her voice when she spoke was very quiet and very clear. "Your father's finances are none of my business, Colton. I've never asked about them. I've never looked at a document I wasn't shown. And if you want to have that argument in front of witnesses, I'm happy to let the record speak." "Winner the record," Colton repeated with a short, dismissive sound. "What record? The one she helped you build, Dad. The one designed to make it look like your decisions were—" "Colton." Diane's voice cut across the table like something dropped from a height. He stopped. She was looking at him with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was 17 years old, and had caught her brother lying to their mother about where he had been on a Friday night. "I need you to stop talking for a minute and listen to me." He looked at her warily. "Diane, I know about the email," she said. "The one you sent to Gerald's office in October, the one with my name on it." She held his gaze and did not look away. "I never agreed to that. I never told you I thought Dad's decisions were questionable. You used my name without asking me, in a legal document. And when I confronted you about it, you told me I was being oversensitive." The room changed. Colton's face went through several things in rapid succession: denial, calculation, the particular scramble of a man whose flank has been exposed, and is trying to decide which direction to run. That email was, he started. Don't, Diane said. One word flat and final with 30 years of sister authority behind it. Don't explain it. Don't qualify it. Just hear me say it clearly, I am not on your side in this. I haven't been since the moment I found out what you did with my name. I placed 3 items on the table. The health screening results from Dr. Carroll. The written assessment from Patricia Wohl confirming my full legal capacity. And a printed copy of Colton's October email to Gerald with Diane's name highlighted in yellow, all 3 occurrences. I'm not signing anything tonight, I said. And I think it would be better for everyone if you took your folder and went home, Colton. Before this becomes a conversation none of us can walk back from. Colton looked at the 3 documents on the table. His hand went to the folder, then stopped. He looked at Diane. She looked at the wall behind him. He looked at Nora. She looked at me. He looked at me last, and in that moment I saw something move through his eyes. Not remorse, not yet, but the beginning of the particular fear that comes when a man realizes the story he has been telling himself does not match the room he is standing in. He picked up his folder. He stood up. He walked to the door, and he left without slamming it, which told me he was still thinking clearly enough to understand that slamming it would cost him something. Diane exhaled. The sound of a woman who has been holding her breath for longer than she realized. Well, she said to no one in particular. That went about as well as I expected. Nora looked at me across the table. Her eyes were steady, her jaw set, her hands unfolded now and resting loose. She looked like a woman who has walked through something hard and come out the other side still standing. I looked at the folder Colton had left on the chair. He had forgotten it in his hurry to maintain dignity on the way out. I left it where it was, 3 weeks until the birthday. Whatever he was building toward, I could feel it coming, the way you feel a change in weather, in the pressure of the air, in the way everything goes very still right before the front moves in. 10 days before my birthday, Nora came by unannounced. She knocked instead of using the spare key I had given her years ago. That told me something had changed before she opened her mouth to tell me what it was. I had the door open before she finished the second knock. She was standing on the porch in her work coat, still in the clothes she had worn to the clinic. A little wind scoured from the parking lot, her hair coming loose from the clip she used on long days. She was holding the brass key in her closed fist, pressed against the center of her chest, like she had been carrying it that way the whole drive over. Come in, I said. It's cold. She came in. She did not sit down. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me, and I saw immediately that she had been crying in the car. Not recently enough for her eyes to be wet, but recently enough for the redness to still be there at the edges, the particular rawness that cold air sets into skin that has been damp. She held out her fist and opened it. The brass key lay in her palm. Take it back, she said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her. I need you to take it back, Russell. I don't want there to be any question from anyone in any room in front of any judge or lawyer or family member about why I have been here, what I wanted, what I was after. She pressed her palm toward me. Take it. I looked at the key. I looked at her face. Sit down, Nora. Russell. Please, I said. Sit down. There's something I need to tell you first. She sat at the kitchen table, still in her coat. Both hands wrapped around the key, now pressing it like she was trying to warm it or hold it still. I sat across from her and took a breath. When Helen was dying, I said, I mean, in the final weeks, the weeks when we both knew and neither of us was pretending otherwise. She said something to me one night. We were sitting in the hospital room, the late shift, the quiet hours when the floor goes still, and you can hear the ventilation system and nothing else. She took my hand, and she said, "Russell, find someone who shows up. Not someone who shows up for something. Someone who just shows up." Nora's throat moved. She pressed her lips together hard. "I have been sitting with that sentence for 6 years," I said. 6 years of watching people come through this house and through this family and counting quietly who showed up and who showed up for something. I leaned forward slightly. "You drove Helen to chemotherapy in February when the roads were bad and Colton was in Phoenix. You sat in my emergency room for 6 hours in 2022 without calling your husband until it was over because you didn't want to give him a reason to come that he could hold over me later. You fixed the handrail on my back steps because you noticed it was loose, not because anyone asked you, not because anyone would ever know you did it." Nora made a sound, low compressed, the sound of someone who has been holding something tightly and has just felt their grip slip. Her eyes filled fast the way eyes fill when a truth they have been waiting to hear finally arrives. "I didn't do those things for," she started. "I know," I said. "That's exactly why I'm telling you." She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth. A single tear broke free and tracked down her cheek, and she let it go, didn't reach for it, just let it run. "Colton thinks giving you the key means I gave you everything," I said. "He's wrong. What I gave you is a responsibility and a set of instructions. Not money, not land, not Helen's jewelry. Those go where I've decided they go, and none of it goes to you personally." I held her gaze. "What you hold in that key is my trust, which is the only thing I have left that I'm certain is worth something." She was crying fully now, not the restrained kind, not the kind a woman allows herself in front of people she's trying to stay composed for, but the deep shaking kind that comes when a person has been carrying something alone for too long and someone finally offers to share the weight. Her shoulders dropped. Her whole body released something it had been bracing against. "Nora," I said. "Push the key back." She looked at me through wet eyes. "Push it back," I said again gently. "It doesn't belong on this side of the table." She looked at the key in her palm for a long moment. Then she slid it across the table toward me. I picked it up, held it for a moment, the same small weight, the same plain brass, and then I placed it back in her open hand and folded her fingers around it, the way I had done in the parking lot of First National Bank 3 months before. "The right people always ask if they're the right person," I said. "The wrong ones never think to wonder." She laughed a wet, broken, genuine laugh that surprised both of us, the kind that comes out when grief and relief arrive at the same moment and can't decide which one should go first. She pressed her closed fist against her sternum again, the key inside it, and sat there breathing for a moment. "He's going to make the party into something," she said when she had steadied. "You know that." "I know," I said. "Whatever he does, whatever he says, I want you to know I'm not going anywhere." She met my eyes. "I'll be there, and I'll stay after." I nodded. "That's all I need." She stood to leave, finally unzipping her coat, now that she had forgotten to be cold. At the door, she paused, hand on the frame, and turned back. "Russell," she said, "what did Helen mean, do you think? Someone who shows up, not for something, just shows up?" I thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "I think she meant," I said, "that there are people who love you and people who love what being near you gives them. And that the distance between those two things is the whole story." Nora looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded once and went out into the cold December evening. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her taillights disappear at the end of the street. Then I looked at the notepad on the refrigerator, Helen's handwriting still there after 6 years. Milk, oranges, The good coffee. 10 days, I thought. 10 days, and it ends. My 80th birthday fell on a Thursday in January. Colton had reserved a private room at Hartwell's, a family restaurant outside Lancaster, white tablecloths, decent salmon and coffee that tasted like it had been introduced to a coffee bean sometime that morning. There were 24 people, family, neighbors, 2 couples from Helen's old church. Gerald and his wife Margaret sitting near the window, Diane across from me, and Nora 2 seats to my left, with the brass key in her coat pocket, which I knew because she touched it once, when she sat down, the small unconscious gesture of a person checking that something important is still where they left it. Colton had been drinking since before the appetizers. Obviously not the loud, stumbling kind of drinking that announces itself. The quiet kind. The refill before the glass is empty kind. By the time the main course arrived, he was on his 3rd glass of the Cabernet he had ordered for the table, and the edges of his performance had gone slightly soft, the way edges go when a man has loosened his grip on the version of himself he has been maintaining for months. The dinner itself was warm. Diane told the story about the summer she was 16, and Colton convinced her that their father did not know she had taken the car without permission. I had known within the hour. She had grounded herself preemptively, and still got a week of no television. People laughed. Someone from Helen's church said a blessing over the table that was so genuine and unhurried that even Colton stopped fidgeting for 30 seconds. Then after the cake, Colton stood up. He tapped his wine glass, the 4th, with a spoon, and waited for the room to settle. He smiled at me across the table. It was a real smile, I think. Or it had been once. Whatever had grown up around it over the years had changed its shape, but something of the original was still there. The boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, now standing in a restaurant he had rented, trying to make one final move in a game he did not know had already ended. To my father, he said. 80 years. Still sharp. Still stubborn. A murmur of warm laughter. Dad, you built something in this family. Something real. And I think... He paused, glancing around the table. I think it's time to make sure what you built comes back to where it belongs. The $2.8 million in land assets that have appreciated this year alone. The room changed, not loudly. No one gasped. But the quality of attention shifted. 24 people recalibrating in real time, registering that a number had entered the room that did not belong at a birthday dinner. Gerald set his coffee cup down. Margaret looked at her plate. Diane stopped breathing. Nora looked at me. I stood up, slowly, with my cane because my knee still reminded me of itself on cold nights, and January in Lancaster is nothing if not cold. I did not rush. I did not raise my voice. When I was on my feet, I looked at my son across the table, and I waited until I was certain every person in that room was paying attention. Thank you, Colton, I said. Since you've brought up numbers, I'd like to answer a few questions. He sat down. He had no choice. In the past 12 months, I said, my son visited me 5 times. I know this because I have a security camera at my front door installed after a neighborhood burglary, and I reviewed the footage. I let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. In that same period, Nora visited 41 times, drove me to 7 medical appointments, fixed a loose handrail on my back steps that my son had promised to fix for 3 months. Colton's hands gripped the edge of the table. Dad, this isn't... I'm not finished, I said, and something in my voice made him stop. 12 years ago, I gave my son $28,000 to save his business from bankruptcy. In 2018, $26,000 for back taxes. In 2021, $18,000 for operating costs. $72,000 total, which he told his wife was profit he had earned himself. I heard Nora draw a careful breath beside me. My son photographed his mother's bracelet through the crack of my study door 7 months ago and sent the image to an antiques dealer in Philadelphia to ask what the stones were worth. His mother has been in the ground for 6 years. The room was very still. And the number he just mentioned, $2.8 million. I looked at Colton directly. That figure appears in one document. A letter sent to my home address in a sealed envelope. The only way my son knows that number is if he opened a letter addressed to me and read it before I did. Colton stood up. His chair scraped back. She put you up to this. His voice cracked on the last word, the thin crack of ice giving way. He pointed at Nora. She has been running this whole thing, manipulating you, turning you against your own family. Colton. Diane's voice came across the table like something thrown. Sit down. He didn't. I was there. Diane said, standing now herself, her voice rising to fill the room cleanly and without effort. I was there when he showed me your email, the one with my name on it that I never agreed to. I was there when you told me Nora was dangerous, and I believed you. I drove to Dad's house and I saw for myself what you had described and what was actually true. Those are not the same thing. Her jaw was set hard, her eyes bright with something that was equal parts grief and fury. I am telling everyone in this room I did not endorse that email. I did not ask for control of my father's estate. And what you just did in front of all these people is exactly why he made the decisions he made. Colton looked around the room. 22 faces looked back at him. None of them gave him what he needed. I sat back down. My knee ached. My chest was steady. You don't have to leave, I said to my son. But if you stay, it has to be as my son, not as a man who came here to win something. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He looked at me one long look, complicated and painful, and too late. And then he walked to the door and went out into the January cold. The door closed behind him. Quiet. Then Gerald's wife, Margaret, said into the stillness, "Should I ask them to bring more coffee?" And someone at the far end of the table laughed, the desperate, relieved laugh of people who have witnessed something hard and are grateful for an ordinary thing to hold on to. The silence after Colton left lasted about 40 seconds. Then Diane sat down, pressed both palms flat on the white tablecloth, and exhaled like a woman who had been holding her breath since October. She was crying. Not loudly, Diane had never been loud about anything, but steadily the way rain comes when there is no wind to drive it sideways. She pressed the back of her hand against her cheek and let it happen. Nora moved her chair closer and put a hand on Diane's arm. Diane looked at her. Really looked the direct look of a woman adjusting her understanding of another person in real time. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what I believed about you. For how long I believed it." Nora shook her head. "You believed your brother," she said. "That's not a crime." "It should have been harder to do," Diane said. "I should have come sooner." "You came," Nora said. "That's what matters now." I watched my 2 daughters, one by blood, one by something that did not have a cleaner name, find each other across a table set for my 80th birthday, in a room still rearranging itself after the storm my son had walked out of, and I thought about Helen saying, "Find someone who shows up," and I thought she would have recognized exactly what she was looking at. Gerald appeared at my elbow. He bent down and said quietly, "I'll reach out to Colton's attorney on Monday. Give him a few days first. Let things settle." "Give him 2 weeks," I said. Gerald looked at me. "You're sure?" "He needs time to sit with it," I said. He can't hear anything right now. He needs to get quiet first. Gerald nodded and straightened. Margaret pressed my hand once as she passed the warm, firm press of a woman who understood what the evening had cost and didn't try to minimize it with words. The party ended gently, the way good things end when people have been through something together and are not quite ready to separate. Neighbors hugged me. Helen's friends said things about her that were true and specific, not the generic things people say at events, but the real things, the remembered things, the kind that tell you a person is still alive in someone's mind. I was grateful for each one. Colton did not come home that night. He stayed at a hotel near the interstate, which I knew because Diane texted me at 10:30. He's okay. Just needs a night. I wrote back, good. Let him. 3 days later, he sent a text. 3 words. We need to talk. I waited 4 days before responding. Then I wrote Thursday. Come by. He came on a Thursday afternoon in late January. No folder, no papers. He sat at the same kitchen table where he had placed the power of attorney 4 months earlier, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man of 44 years old, who had spent a long time running from a reflection and had finally run out of room. I shouldn't have done what I did at the party, he said. No, I said. I was angry. He rubbed both hands over his face. I felt like everything was being taken from me and I just... He stopped. I know how that sounds. How does it sound? He looked at the table. Like I cared more about the money than about you. Did you... A long pause. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. Colton lifted his eyes and looked at me, and for the first time in a very long time I saw my son instead of the calculation my son had become. I don't know, he said, and his voice broke open on the last word, raw and genuine and terrible, to hear the sound of a man telling the truth after a long time of not doing it. I think I convinced myself they were the same thing, that taking care of the money was taking care of you, that knowing what you had was the same as knowing you. He pressed his fist against his mouth. It wasn't. I know that. Yes, I said. You do. He sat there with that for a moment, breathing. Can I fix it? You can try, I said. That's all fixing anything ever is. What do you need me to do? Stop counting, I said. Everything you've been calculating, what's in the estate, what you'll receive, what's owed, what's changed. Stop. Come here because I'm your father. Not because of what that means financially. Just because I'm your father, and I'm 79 years old, and I'd like to see my son sometimes, before I'm not here to see him anymore. His jaw worked. His eyes went red. He pressed his fist harder against his mouth and breathed through his nose until he had himself back. Okay, he said finally. Okay, Dad. Gerald executed the final trust documents in February of 2025. The 3 land parcels sold to Keystone Commercial Partners at the agreed price. Colton received his share adjusted for the $72,000 previously advanced, which he did not contest. Diane received hers. The charitable allocation went to the Lancaster County Senior Services Trust, supporting transportation to medical appointments, minor home repairs, and independent living assistance for older adults in the county. Helen's jewelry remained in Box 417 at First National Bank. 3 velvet pouches, 3 sets of diamonds, 1 wedding band worn smooth on the inside from 41 years of marriage. Waiting for the grandchildren to be old enough to understand what it meant to the woman who wore it. Nora kept the brass key. Not because it opened anything anymore, the box remained, but the key's formal purpose had become secondary to what it represented. She kept it in the pocket of her winter coat, and sometimes when she sat down somewhere that mattered, I saw her hand move to it. the way hands move to things they trust. My son is not the man he was at that birthday dinner. He is not yet the man I hope he becomes. But he comes on Thursdays without a folder, without a number in his head that he is calculating against my remaining years. He comes and sits at the kitchen table and drinks coffee, and sometimes we talk about his mother, and sometimes we talk about nothing in particular, and that I have decided is enough to build on. I forgave my son, but I did not return the control he lost on his own. Money can be divided in minutes. Trust has to be rebuilt one action at a time. And I am still here watching, keeping track not of what anyone stands to gain, but of who shows up. Just shows up. I have told you the truth of what happened in my house, in my family, in the years after Helen left me here alone to figure out what mattered. Here is what I know now that I did not know clearly enough before. Love is not a feeling you announce. It is a practice. It is the drive through February snow. It is the handrail fixed without being asked. It is showing up not for something, just showing up. I believe God puts people in our lives not to complete us, but to reveal us. Nora did not change who Colton was. She simply stood close enough that the light hit him differently. What people saw was always there. It had just never been examined in a room full of witnesses. If I could say one thing to anyone listening who recognizes themselves in my son, not the villain version, but the ordinary version, the version that got busy and distracted and started measuring love in inheritance and expectation, I would say this: do not wait for a birthday dinner to understand what your family has been carrying. Do not let the people who quietly hold your life together become invisible until they are gone. I was that man once in smaller ways. I am not proud of it. These grandpa stories are not easy to tell. But I tell them because I believe family story is worth more than silence, and because the people in your life deserve to be seen before it is too late. If something in this grandpa stories touched you, if you recognized a Russell, a Nora, or a Colton in your own life, leave a comment below and tell me what you saw. Share this family story with someone who needs it. And if these grandpa stories mean something to you, subscribe to Dad's Revenge Stories so you never miss what comes next. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the very end of this family story. It means more than you know. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and life lessons. If this type of content is not for you, we respect that completely. Please feel free to explore other content that serves you better. But if you stay, we promise to always give you something worth your time.